All right, everybody. This is going to be the third and final video that I do kind of reflecting on my 100-mile and 12-hour world record race at the Pettit Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The first two videos I used to focus kind of on two topics. One topic being kind of the race itself and kind of my history and those sorts of events. And then the other one was like kind of what I did in training to kind of prepare for that specific event this year. And the third one is going to kind of be the nutritional component of it all. When you're running ultra marathons, nutrition becomes kind of a very big topic because, people are fueling during these events and they're fueling during their workouts, during their recovery in a variety of different ways. Mine is, I guess, a little bit more peculiar than what a lot of times people see. So I get a lot of questions about it. So I thought it'd probably be worthwhile to kind of share the protocol I took going into this so that folks who have questions about that can check this video out and then send me any other questions they might have after it. My nutrition plan in general is like a high fat, low carb approach to endurance. And when I say that, I mean, I don't mean strict keto, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Or I don't mean zero carbohydrates or no carbohydrates altogether. What I mean by that is that the foundation of my nutrition is based on fats and proteins. So once I kind of have that foundation in place, I will use carbohydrates from time to time as kind of a tool for performance. So the question then becomes the when and the how of how to kind of do that. So for me, what's worked really well in the past is I'll do phases where I will go pretty strict keto or even zero carb from time to time during kind of lower intensity, lower volume recovery phases of the year. And then as I kind of start building up my training and start getting into some higher volume and some intensity work, I'll start to bring back small amounts of carbohydrate to kind of fuel those higher intense workouts or those longer sessions that I'll do during kind of peak training and racing. For me specifically, that foundation of fats and proteins tends to be pretty heavy on animal products, a lot of meats, fatty cuts and meats, a lot of dairies and eggs and fish and that sort of stuff. And then it just becomes kind of a working target number of how much energy I need depending on kind of what I'm doing. I also tend to kind of look at energy expenditure perhaps a little differently than what you may see. I think a lot of times people will look at energy expenditure and kind of think of it as a 24-hour clock where every 24 hours it kind of resets, and then the next day you have to get in X numbers of calories to meet the needs of what you're doing and whatever lifestyle you live. And that probably works well for some folks. I don't like taking that approach personally. For one, I don't like to sit around and just count and add up everything. I don't like to track everything to the T. I will from time to time when I get questions and stuff like that, and just so that I kind of have an idea of what I'm doing. But more often than not, I'm kind of operating intuitively based on kind of what my body's telling me. And what happens to work best for me in that context is working more along the lines of like a 3-day window where I might have like 2 days where my training is really aggressive, where I'm putting in, sometimes upwards to 8+ hours on a weekend, a Saturday, Sunday weekend day, and burning 2 to 3 times my resting metabolic rate. So for those days, just given the amount of time I'm out there running and the amount of energy I'm burning, it's really hard to kind of match that calorie intake without just eating massive amounts of food. So I like to use that as kind of a spot in my training where I might not match my my energy output for those like 2 big sessions. But then that 3rd day, after I have 2 big sessions like that, my direction is going to swerve towards recovery. I'm going to try to absorb all that work I just did. So I'm going to have an easy day, maybe even an off day altogether. And on that day, I'm going to eat quite a bit more than what my energy demands need. And then over the course of those 3 days, I more or less balance out, especially once I get down to like the point at where I want to be for racing weight wise, and don't want to lose another ounce if I can help it. So I'm kind of operating in a little bit of a longer window with that. And I feel like that works really well in the context of a higher fat diet, just because you just tend to be able to kind of turn to body fat a little more readily, and you don't have those big energy swings that you would if you had a foundation in a carbohydrate based diet. That's just my experience. You can do whatever you want, whatever works for you. At the end of the day, I think, getting in the work and feeling good about it, trusting your training process, feeling good amounts of energy, doing everything in life, sleeping well, being in a good mood, being happy, those are all good indicators of if your nutrition's on point. So, everyone can kind of find their own personal path through that. So for me, when it gets to the point where I'm starting to add more things in, the big change is the carbohydrates I'll add in. And the ones that I tend to gravitate to the most are more or less preference-based. This isn't necessarily a tutorial, and these are the good carbs versus the bad carbs. I think everyone can kind of figure out for themselves which ones are going to be better for them or that they enjoy the most. For me, I like to kind of bring back in some potatoes, some fruit, and some raw honey. Those are kind of the ones that I found work really well for me. And during workouts or big races and things like that, the carbohydrates I take in are almost primarily from a company called X Endurance. They make a powder called Fuel 5 and Fuel 5 Plus. And that's what I'll mix in with my water if I'm looking to bring in a little bit of carbohydrate during like a big workout or, during a race or something like that, where fueling is going to be part of the equation. And I'll put a specific link to that in the show notes as well, so that those of you who are interested in seeing more about it or possibly getting some, you'll have access to that. Plus my link will get you a discount too, so you can save a few bucks if you want. At the end of the day, the way I usually like to describe it to people, if you look at my calendar year, you average out all the days where my carbs are at their highest, and then you average out the days where my carbs are at their lowest. I'm probably right around 10% carbohydrate intake on average over the course of an entire year. There may be some stretches where I'm flexing that up above 20% of my intake, and then there may be recovery times where I'm flexing that down to 0 or next to nothing. So that's kind of where it comes out holistically. The other thing I like to share too, because it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before with operating under that 3-day window versus, say, a 24-hour cycle, is when my carbohydrates are the highest, they tend to be during those days where my energy levels, where my energy expenditures are also the highest. So if you think back to what I said before, those days I'm often running a calorie deficit, which I intend to make up on a recovery day. So say I flex my carbohydrate intake up to 25% of my total intake for those 2 weekend days I described before. That's 25% of my intake. That doesn't account for body fat that I'm inevitably going to be burning if I'm running a deficit on those 2 days. So the actual energy utilization is probably a fair bit lower than that from a fat to carbohydrate ratio. But that's somewhat semantics at this point. I think ultimately when I'm working with folks who want to use a high fat, low carb approach to endurance, we're going to play around with different ranges of grams during some of these intensities. And figure out what's going to work best for them. And we're going to let their training and the results be the guide. That's going to be the compass. I think where people run into problems sometimes and when they don't see that as the compass, where they start following a specific nutrition plan because, their friend told them it works well, or because they saw someone else do it and it worked really well for their friend. And they don't kind of take into account that individual context of the whole situation. So playing around with those, you can kind of find out what's going to work best for you. And maybe that's quite a bit different than me. Maybe that's exactly the same as me. There's only one way to really find out, and that's to kind of give it a go and try it if you're interested in it. So let's get to the race day itself, which I like to look at the environment before I kind of come up with a bit of a plan. Going into races, usually I'll have like a plan A, a plan B, and then maybe even a plan C. So my plan A is always going to be the fuel source that I feel the most comfortable with, I have the most experience with, and that I know has worked for me time and time and time again. And then I'm going to have a plan B that is just kind of something different than my A plan, just in case for whatever reason plan A doesn't end up working well for me, or if the race is so long and you just kind of get bored of having the same thing over and over again, it can add a little variety and even maybe get you a little excited at a point in the race where you're kind of losing energy and getting bored out there from just the long amount of time you're spending out on the trails, roads, or the track. So then there's plan C. Plan C is more or less like a last resort thing where I have an idea of what I would do if plan A and plan B would fall off and I no longer have an option at there. And that usually just tends to be me looking at the race website I'm going to and picking out like a few things that they list on their website that I could use if I needed to kind of flex down to that plan C. For the Dome, I had that kind of stuff in place, but things went so well nutritionally that I never even deviated from plan A. Was actually the first 100-miler that I've done where I went purely liquid nutrition and basically took in almost the entirety of my calories from one single product. And that was that Fuel 5 by X Endurance. So the way I had it set up was I wanted to take a bottle of water every 30 minutes on the track. And then kind of as I got used to being in that environment at the Pettit Center, kind of figure out what was going to be an appropriate amount of like ounces per that 30 minutes. What ended up happening is I usually kind of range between 8 to 16 ounces every 30 minutes, depending on kind of where, my thirst levels were at. If I felt thirsty, I would take the 16 ounces and have no problem taking that down. If I didn't feel super thirsty, but maybe just a little bit, I would just ask for 8 ounces. And then I knew, given the ease of access to your crew on an event like I just did, every 443 meters if you want it, I thought I could always ask for more if I need more later. But that worked really well, kind of keeping it between 8 to 16 ounces based on thirst. And then what I was doing is within those bottles of water, I was mixing approximately 20 grams of that Fuel 5 every 30 minutes. So it came out to be around 40 grams per hour or 20 grams every 30 minutes. And that was basically the entirety of what I took in nutrition-wise from a calorie standpoint during the course of the day. So all liquid, all that Fuel 5, and it just was working well, and I never saw a reason to deviate from it. A track 100-miler is a lot shorter in time just by nature of, the course being a lot easier to navigate than, say, a mountain course or a trail race, which can take well longer than that for the same distance. So maybe had I had to be out there for, say, 16, 17 hours, I would have eventually wanted something else than that for those reasons mentioned before. The other thing I added to my Fuel 5 and water combo was starting at hour 5, I started putting in these sachets of a product called Unamate by a company named Unicity. And basically my angle for that was I wanted a bit of a caffeine source in the second half of the race. So one thing I've noticed in my own kind of experience, both in day-to-day life and training, is when it comes to caffeine, they're not all exactly the same. I'll have a cup of coffee sometimes in the morning and go out for a run. And when I drink coffee, I feel like I get like a pretty good pop of energy right away. And then it kind of eventually fades off. And then, sometimes you hit a little bit of a low because it wore off. When I use yerba mate, a tea, I get a little bit of a different sensation. The way I kind of describe it is it's less jittery and kind of more of a calm, focused energy. And I find this works really well for long endurance events just because the idea is that you stay focused and you stay calm. Even with my pace at the 100-mile and 12-hour, it's relatively slow to what I could do for like an hour or 2 hours, or if I was doing anything that was like VO2 max or even threshold based. So the overall relative intensity is kind of low. So there wasn't a huge incentive for me to try to trigger a huge energy burst that may be met with kind of a bit of a crash down the road. So I went with a yerba mate blend from Unicity that's called Unamate. And it's just these little sachets they're instant mix. So I could easily just put those into the bottles with the Fuel 5 and with the water and shake it up and kind of have it all at once and essentially kill 3 birds with 1 stone. And the protocol with that was I started at hour 5, and then every hour after that, at the top of the hour, I would do 1 more of those sachets. That's basically it. That's how it went. I felt like my energy was super constant all day. My digestion was on point. I stopped 3 times at this particular event for a total of maybe 4 minutes or so, which is pretty efficient for these. The most efficient I've ever done was at Desert Solstice in 2015, where I stopped twice for I think like 60 to 90 seconds. And I don't necessarily count on that being the reality, since that one was the best one I've ever had from an efficiency standpoint. At Desert Solstice in 2013, I stopped for 3 times. I don't remember for how long total, but it was more likely around 3 minutes. So usually when I'm kind of budgeting bathroom breaks or nutrition breaks or whatever it's going to stop me from running when the clock is still moving, I try to get at least a ballpark figure with that when I'm calculating kind of my race intensity and race pace if I'm targeting a specific time. So usually I'll go into one of these events like what I did at the Pettit Center and assume there's going to be about 3 to 5 minutes worth of non-moving time, just so I can kind of get my pacing more fine-tuned. The second piece of the puzzle is kind of after the race. And I think a lot of times people think of the race specifically as that should be your compass of how your nutrition looks all the time. And I think that's a kind of an oversight, because even a race as long as mine that took 12 hours to finish, I'm spending way more time preparing for that event. I'm spending way more time recovering from that event. So I think these need to be kind of categorized separately. So when I finish an event like that, that's where I kind of enter that phase I was talking about earlier, where I am going to kind of cut out almost all the carbohydrates altogether. And sometimes it depends on kind of what I have coming up next. I feel like I bounce back a lot quicker when I just focus a lot on fats and proteins post-race and avoid the carbohydrates almost altogether. So if I have something else coming up, I'm a lot more strict about that. If it's the last race of the season and I don't have anything coming up for a few months, I'm going to take a few weeks off and not even focus on any structured training for quite a while. Sometimes I'll be a little more relaxed on that, especially if I'm going and hang out with friends or doing something like that's not kind of in the normal routine. So that's kind of how I've been doing things post-race. I've been focusing quite a bit on fats and a lot of proteins to kind of get my body recovered and ready to go again, because I do have another race that is almost exactly 5 weeks after the Pettit Center race, going over to Greece and run the Spartathlon. It's a super historic 153-mile race out that way. So I want to make sure I have as many tools in my toolbox from a recovery standpoint to be ready to go for that and get in a couple more quality long runs between now and then and kind of entering taper mode again. But that's kind of a basic outline of my nutrition, kind of how I went about preparing for this specific event and then the race itself. If you're more interested in kind of those specific periods of training that I spoke about, like the recovery phases, the base building phases, the peak training phases, the taper, the race itself, that sort of stuff, I do have some other videos on this YouTube channel that kind of dive into those specifically in a little more detail. But if you have any other questions about this or would like me to dive deeper into any other aspect of this sort of thing, don't hesitate to reach out. You can find me on my website at zachbitter.com. I'm most active on Instagram and Twitter. Instagram is @ZachBitter. Twitter is @ZBitter. But thanks for checking out this video.